Chapter 22. Never in the history of the land of the immortals had there been such a hush on the day before Christmas. For as long as anyone could remember, and some of them had memories that stretched many centuries, the day that led to Christmas Eve was a time of bustle and rush. Last-minute bows were tied, music swelled from every home, and kitchens began to hum and bubble with activity. This year, all was quiet. In the workshops, Gilfins and goblins efficiently packed toys for delivery, and Donner discussed flight patterns with Comet. But these were the only signs of the coming Christmas journey. The streets were deserted, no bells sounded from the towers. Delicious aromas did not curl from the chimneys. Even the fairies sat soberly in their delicate, cobwebby palaces, waiting. They were all waiting. Up in the castle, Nicholas, Viviana, and Sophia had spent nearly every moment of the last 3 days in Holly's room, taking turns peering through the enchanted telescope. Intently they had watched as Holly arrived in the Empire City and brought the compassion of her heart to the mortal world. At first there had been a few smiles, a little laughter, but now they simply watched, waiting for Heracon to finish the task he had begun so many years before. Sophia had known almost immediately that the genial Mr. Hartman was Heracon in disguise. There was something about the way he looked at Holly that just wasn't quite human. She focused closely on his mouth, then his hair where the little band of silver twinkled furtively. Then she handed Nicholas the telescope, shaking her head. Nicholas gazed into the glass for a long time. "It's him," he agreed. He walked to the window and stared without seeing at the snow outside. There was nothing he could do. There was nothing anyone could do until Christmas Eve. Finally, that day had dawned. Nicholas and Viviana sat stiffly on a sofa, their hands clasped, their eyes wide and dry. Sophia stood at the window, squinting into the white sky, trying to remember what was supposed to happen next. After a while, she gave up. There were simply too many different endings. They waited. The clock struck 7. The clock struck 7, and Holly awoke with a gasp of terror. Frantically, she brushed away the phantom fingers that coiled dry and sinewy around her neck and wound up through her hair. She sat up, tearing, clawing at nothing. The only sound was that of her own panting breath. Weak sunlight streamed in through the open window, catching on a clutter of shining toys that lay on the floor. Holly stared at them fixedly, disentangling the threads of nightmare and reality that held her until memory returned in a flood. "Oh," she breathed, sitting up. It was early yet, and all the world was quiet. Her eyes fell upon Christopher, fast asleep in an uncomfortable-looking chair in the center of the rug, and she smiled tenderly. He was wearing a heavy coat with a fur collar against the cold. She reflected that he must have put it on rather than close the window she had asked him to open. And this little mark of consideration brought a tightness to her throat. Everything will be decided today, she reflected. Then the unfathomable thought, this may be the last time I see him. Quietly, she gathered up her rustling gown and tiptoed to his chair. She knelt beside him, learning his face. He looked much younger with his eyes closed, she decided, less haunted, more like a boy. More like the boy who had written the letter to Santa Claus. She shook her head in wonderment. He stirred restlessly, and she caught her breath. Let him sleep. She rose and walked from the room. Through the clock face she went again, feeling as though she was returning from 100-year voyage. On she walked through the dark hall, the velvet curtains, and down into the toy shop, astonished to find that the walls and rugs and toys had remained the same while her universe had changed entirely. They would have been an odd sight if there had been anyone but the pigeons to see them. Holly in her golden gown walked through the snowy streets, talking absorbedly to the wolf at her side. Actually, she was talking to all 4 of her friends, telling them of the wondrous inventions of the world behind the great door, of the malevolent black box that showed a dark future, and of the great discovery that Mr. Carroll was none other than the Christopher they had heard of so many, many times before. On and on she talked, but there was one thing she could not find a way to describe, and that was the new feeling that sang inside her. The little animals, listening from within the satchel, guessed that something was afoot, But Tundra, who could see her face, knew for certain that Holly was in love. Finally, Lexi from inside the satchel interrupted Holly to inquire sharply, "Why are we walking around in the freezing cold? Holly, do you have any idea where you're going?" Holly burst out laughing. "You're right, Lexi. I had forgotten. We're going to Mrs. Kleiner's so I can change my clothes and get back to the toy shop when it opens." "And see him again, she added to herself. "And see him again," added Tundra to himself. Though he said nothing, Holly's happiness filled him with dread. It was one more obstacle between her and safety, one more reason she would be reluctant to leave this world. Over and over, like a charm against fear, he pictured her stepping into the sleigh next to Nicholas. That was all. One foot on the runner, the other lifting up out of the snow, her hands reaching out to clasp her father's. Just let that happen, he said to himself. Just let that come true. The door of the boarding house creaked warningly as they entered, and Holly could smell the delicious scent of warm muffins and coffee wafting from the kitchen. But a sudden doubt about the propriety of appearing in her evening gown at 7:30 in the morning assailed her. After an exchange of nods, Holly and Tundra and the satchel made their way up the carpeted stairs without a sound. Silently, they proceeded down the hallway to Holly's room and slipped in the door. "We did it," whispered Holly exultantly to Tundra. "No one's the wiser." "I wouldn't be too certain, my dear," said a soft, whistling voice in the corner of the room. "I, for one, am distinctly wiser than I was last night." Holly froze. Tundra, at her side, felt his heart begin to hammer against his chest. A dark figure rose from a chair and walked gracefully to the window. The curtain was pulled aside with a swift motion, and they stood facing a smiling Hunter Hartman. "Your rejected swain, in the flesh," sang the strange, whistling voice that seemed ill-matched to the bulk and height of the man. "Do I surprise you, my dear? Do forgive me," he giggled a little, "but I wish to repay the surprise I endured last night with one of my own. I must have my little joke." There was something silky and servile in the speech that filled Holly with contempt. "Get out," she said. "Get out, or I'll call for help." His laughter was more frightening than threats. "Get out? I don't think so. And," he added, his face suddenly growing cold, "I'll kill anyone who walks through that door. So be careful whom you call." He saw that she shivered. "Good. I'm glad you are so sensible. Now, dearest, let us discuss the events of last night before we proceed. I admit that I was wrong about you. I admit it handsomely. I was under the impression, which I now recognize as mistaken, that you were attracted to the glamour of mortal life. The telescope, my gift to you, for which I was never thanked, by the way, was designed to dwell on that very aspect of human exchange, and when I saw you peering through it night and day for all those years, I grew quite certain that you were bedazzled by the lives of the great and grand." Hartman smiled, showing brilliant white teeth inside his dark mouth. "I thought that growing up in that musty old castle surrounded by those insipid, sugary little goblins and fairies, not to mention your insufferable father," Holly put one hand warningly on Tundra's head, "that you would welcome a little light and life. But apparently I was wrong." He glared at her with disgust. "You're even worse than they are. All that mucking about in the park with filthy urchins and distributing dollies to the mob should have told me. But perhaps I was infatuated," he snickered. "So I thought to tempt you with earthly delights, a brush with high society, a nod from Mrs. Astor, and, as the final blow, a bauble that would serve the dual purpose of winning your heart and allowing me to remove that infernal locket." His narrow eyes rested on the necklace at Holly's throat. "My goals did not appear unreasonable, but I reckoned without your lamentable purity of spirit and, well, you know the rest." "And so now," Holly said, trying to keep her voice from shaking, "now, sweet, I will prove my generosity by offering you one more chance. Come with me, Holly, and I will give you anything in all the world that you desire." Holly shifted nervously. She and Tundra exchanged glances. This was too easy. "No, I will not," she said. He ran one finger around the inside of his collar. "These clothes drive me mad," he remarked conversationally. "You say no. Very well. I will ask you once more, just once more. Holly, will you come with me and be my bride? Think carefully before you answer." Holly shook her head silently. He smiled. "Your answer does not surprise me, nor does it displease me. This way will be much more thrilling for me, though, of course, less enjoyable for you. But that's not my fault. Always remember, I offered you a way out. Now the first thing is to remove this disgusting flesh." Before Holly's terrified eyes, he raised his hands to his forehead and dug his nails into his skin. Then he pulled, grunting with effort, until the warm pink skin hove up and rose. A little silver began to show through. He dug and tore at his face until it hung with ribbons of flesh. Trembling, Holly backed up until she was pressed against the door. Tundra placed himself in front of her, never taking his eyes off the being before him. Heracon was done with his face, though skin flapped around his neck, and had begun to work on his hands. The crabbed and shriveled fingers appeared, but the work apparently went too slowly for Heracon's satisfaction. With a hiss, he stopped his peeling and inserted his hands into his mouth. His jaw distended, and his mottled black and gray tongue jutted out. But he continued to pull and pull until, with a light snapping like twigs breaking, he turned his mouth inside out. Holly and Tundra caught one glimpse of slippery gray tissue, and then it was done. Heracon stood before them in his silver skin, lank gray hair against his scabbed scalp where the iron bit into the flesh, and yellowing robes. He scratched a remaining strand of pink with a long, dirty finger. "Not so comfortable, but faster," he said, "and time is of the essence." His eyes, thin and flat like pewter discs, regarded Holly. "You see the trouble I went to for you. You should have taken Hartman while you had the chance. Well, no matter, let us proceed. You did me a great favor last night, my dear. I shall be in your debt for eternity," he wheezed with laughter. "I am not speaking of your treatment of me, of course, but of your interview with young Mr. Carroll." Holly uttered an involuntary cry of dismay. Heracon looked at her sharply. "Did you think I wouldn't see you? Did you think you could keep a secret from me? You have no idea what I'm capable of." "Tell me," said Holly. "Tell me what you're capable of." "I was once a king to rival your father," Heracon replied, almost dreamily. "They bowed to me, their foreheads in the mud, for me. They loved me. And then," his voice went cold, "was cast into a rotting pit for centuries. I was left alone in the sweat and steam for hundreds and hundreds of years. The elders thought they had buried me forever, but I outwitted them, didn't I? I grew stronger and stronger down there, for I had all the time I needed to plan my escape. I must have the stink of pure fear to venture outside my abode, and I made it happen, even in forever. I found you, and I preserved your baby heart in snow, and I made you come here, where fear is more plentiful than air. And in the end, I will own you. And at that moment, this cursed ring that binds my head will shatter, and I will be able to breathe and prosper wherever I choose, for as long as I see fit, instead of being forced to return to that sewer each day like a miserable worm in order to regain my strength." He glowered at the thought. "In answer to your question, my dear, there is nothing I will not do to free myself. Nothing." "What will you do then, when you are free?" asked Holly, watching him closely. "What will I do? I will begin on earth with the mortal trash, and I will build an empire bigger than the one I had before. It's a simple task, but essential. After I've accomplished this, I shall begin my assault on your own land. Just think," he smiled. "You will depose your own mother, for of course you will be my queen, such an honor. Perhaps you will even preside over their departure. I'm picturing something of a ceremony. Nicholas will take up residence in my cell, and you and I will enter the castle of forever as its rulers. Tundra was making a sound in his throat that Holly had never heard before. Heracon flicked a look at him, and she held him with a shaking hand. And then I will take all those adorable little fairies and sprites and goblins and heroes, and I will break them. His gray face shivered with rage. Why? Asked Holly simply. The pewter eyes suddenly looked confused, but the moment passed swiftly. Shut up, and shut up your wolf, too. Holly felt Tundra tense to spring and prayed that he would not. I've had my eye on you all along, dog. I thought I was going to be forced to use you as bait, though to my mind your value seemed rather limited. Thinking that two would be more compelling than one, I even regretted that I killed your mate in such a hasty manner. What was her name? Terra the Terrible, he smirked. Tundra leaped for his neck, but never reached his target. Smiling, Heracon extended his hand, and the wolf dropped limply to the floor. No, moaned Holly, hurling himself toward him. Tundra, no, please. She gathered the body in her arms and rocked him gently. Tundra, come back, she pleaded. Tundra, don't leave me. Don't leave me, she whispered into his ear. He lay still in the circle of her arms. Don't bother, he's dead, said Heracon. Holly looked up, tears streaming down her face. Why? Why did you do it? You ask too many questions. You shall have to learn to please me better. However, making an exception just this once, I'll tell you why. He was of no use to me. I found something better, thanks to you, Mr. Christopher Carroll. And rest assured, young lady, that what I'll do to him will make your Tundra's death look like paradise. Please, not Christopher. He's done nothing, whispered Holly, her hands clasping Tundra's fur convulsively. Of course he's done nothing, hissed Heracon in exasperation. That's why you'll want to save him. That, and the fact that you're in love with him. Why else would I have chosen him? Christopher Carroll means nothing to me. I even rather like him, or I did until yesterday when he showed up at the opera house to keep you from the filthy clutches of Mr. Hunter Hartman. Then he began to annoy me. But now I am fond of him again, for he is my best weapon yet. For his sake, you will remove that tiresome locket, and for his sake, you will give your heart to me. You were in the toy shop last night? Asked Holly, stunned. Of course, I arrived before you did. Where were you? He smiled mockingly. Are you embarrassed to discover that your little romance had a spectator? Never fear, I only stayed long enough to learn what I needed. Your secrets, tedious as they are safe with me. Holly didn't say anything. Instead, she stroked Tundra's rough fur. What would he have advised her to do? What would he have wanted? Would he have wanted her to take the chance? Should she try it? Oh, Tundra, I need you now, she thought desperately. In answer, she seemed to hear his low voice saying, You have nothing to lose. That's right, she thought. She kept her eyes on the wolf. Then after a moment, she said, So then you came here and waited all night. Does my devotion charm you? Not exactly, she said, bending to kiss Tundra one last time. Slowly, she rose to her feet, and Heracon's silvery skin began to quiver with excitement. You are altogether more tractable than I expected, Holly, he said, holding out his hand for the locket. I think, she began, backing toward the door again. Her shoes met the satchel, and she pushed it furtively behind her. I think that you have miscalculated again. I've been calculating myself as you talked. You've been here for 12 hours, probably more. You yourself said that you must return to your place each day, and so I'm guessing that your magic is on the verge of failing. In fact, I'm guessing that you would find it nearly impossible to kill everyone out on the street right now if I were to. Her hand on the brass knob turned quickly, and snatching the satchel up, she whisked away around the edge of the door and ran down the hallway. A long, furious hiss followed her. expecting any second to see Harricon before her, and desperately hoping that Mr. and Mrs. Kleiner would not appear to become his victims. Holly stumbled down the stairs as fast as her feet could carry her. "Is that you, Miss Claus?" called Mrs. Kleiner from the kitchen. "I was just going to come up and wake you." Without the breath to reply, Holly ran out the front door. Frantically, she looked both ways and dove toward the most crowded streets. He had been on Earth for a long time. He must be weakening. He had said that he had to go back to Odal every 24 hours, but what he hadn't told her was how long he had to stay. A glint of silver caught her eye, and she gasped in horror. But no, it was just a man pulling his watch out of his pocket. Holly fought to still the thundering of her heart and slow her steps. People were looking at her in amazement. Still clad in her golden gown, with her hair tumbling down her back in a tangle of curls, she flew like a hunted bird through the slushy streets. The streets were growing more and more crowded. Church bells were ringing out, and carolers clustered at a few corners, singing the ancient songs. Holly saw cheerful children wiggling with excitement, vigorous old men marching out of the baker's with loaves under both arms, a sturdy cook with a goose in her basket, and a young mother with a baby in a perambulator. Their happiness seemed to exist in a world Holly no longer lived in. "Hey, it's the doll girl!" Two dark-eyed girls balanced precariously on the edge of the curb, waving. "Where are you going, doll girl?" She remembered them. She remembered their hands closing around their dream dolls the day before. They had looked at her with shining eyes, and she had known that their dreams, their futures, were her life's purpose. When they became immortals, they must be able to enter the land of forever. She summoned up all her strength and replied, "I'm going to work. Merry Christmas!" Then she began to run again. Her breath was ragged when she reached the shop. She could see Mr. Kleiner through the window, stepping back to admire a display of sailboats. Jeremy, at his side, was nodding approval. A few customers wandered through the aisles. She bowed her head and whispered, "Please, please, don't let them come to misery through me." And then she walked through the door. "Miss Claus, in heaven's name!" Mr. Kleiner was exclaiming. "What happened?" Jeremy glanced behind her. "Holly, where's Tundra at?" he asked quickly. Holly looked from one to the other and shook her head. "Tundra's dead. Please don't make me explain. I have to go see Christopher. Mr. Carroll, right away. Just let me go." They stepped back to let her pass. As swiftly as her pounding heart would allow, she climbed the stairs and pushed through the velvet curtains. The sight of the clock on the door shook her, and it had only been a few hours that she had passed through the portal in joy. Now her most precious friend was in peril. She felt utterly responsible for it all. Gently touching the number 3, she slipped inside Christopher's studio. Toys were buzzing and whizzing, and a brilliantly lighted galaxy spun from the ceiling, but their creator was not in sight. Someone began to whistle in the next room. She stared emptily at the window for a minute or two. Then she straightened. "Christopher?" she called softly. The whistling stopped. His head peered around the edge of a door. "Holly!" he exclaimed, a smile flashing across his face. "I was thinking it might have been a dream." He strode toward her and lifted her hand to his lips. "I'm so glad you came back," he said. "I can't get along without you now." A wave of desolation broke over her. "You wouldn't say that if you knew," she said, trembling. "Holly, what's the matter? You're so pale, my love. Sit down here. I'll open the window." He flung open the casement and then returned to her side. "Sit down. Tell me what's happened. Was there some sort of trouble at home?" he asked kindly, seating himself next to her. Holly said bleakly, "Yes, there was. And part of it's about you. I don't know how to begin," she faltered. "Just begin at the beginning," he said. Holly buried her face in her hands. "All right," she said slowly. "The beginning is you. When you were 10 years old, you wrote to Santa Claus and asked him what he wished for Christmas. What he wished for was me. I am Santa's daughter." She looked up. Christopher's face was fixed in a polite half-smile, as if in response to a bad joke. "I am Santa Claus's daughter," she repeated, "and I am the only child ever to be born in the land of the immortals. When a mortal soul sheds its body, it comes to my country if it has belonged to a human whose deeds and thoughts live beyond the span of the mortal life. It's a magical place, too, and all the enchanted creatures who have done good on earth live there as well. I am the only one who did nothing to earn a place there. What I did instead was to bring a curse on my land and my people. A curse, Christopher repeated in a blank voice. Yes, because of my birth 17 years ago, a curse came to forever. That's the other name of my country. There's a warlock named Heracon who was once very powerful. But he was proud and greedy and abused his power, and for his crimes he was imprisoned for many centuries. For a long time he didn't know that he could earn his way to freedom by possessing a heart of pure compassion. And then, once he found out, he spent many centuries looking for the owner of this heart. But she broke off, not sure how to continue. But she repeated, taking a deep breath, I was the one. He needs my heart to become free. One night when I was a baby, he set it in ice to keep it safe. That's why I must always have cold around me. And he cursed the land of the immortals. Ever since that night, no new souls have joined the immortal world, and none of us have ventured out, except for my father on Christmas Eve. And now, me. She looked searchingly at Christopher's face. You, indeed, he said stiffly. She watched him for a sign of understanding, but she saw nothing in his eyes. Desperately, she continued, he's here, or rather, he's not here right now, but he'll be back. My heart must be given willingly. That's the rule, and there is nothing he will not do to force my hand. He killed Tundra, and he knows about you. About me, said Christopher coldly. What has this story to do with me? Holly pressed her hands against her throbbing head. He knows that I love you, she whispered. Christopher's laugh was embarrassed. He stood abruptly and walked to the window. Miss Claus, he said, not looking at her. You honor me with your affection, but I'm sorry to say that I find all of this a trifle, well, implausible. Holly's face grew white. You don't believe me? You must admit it's somewhat outside the bounds of reason. Her eyes rested on his unmoving back. I never thought that you, she began, and stopped. I believed you, she said. She heard his sharp intake of breath. He turned, his face defensive. But Santa Claus, warlocks, curses, the land of the immortals, it's preposterous. There is no Santa Claus. There is. He's my father. You believed in him once, and your belief brought my soul into this universe. Christopher shook his head. No, it's impossible. Holly's green eyes slowly filled with tears. She had never felt so alone. Defeated, she sat upon the old sofa with her cheeks clasped together and tears streaming down her cheeks. Christopher looked away, his face rigid. Her teardrops fell on her hands and quivered there, turning to ice. Soon, Holly's forlorn figure was seated in a swirl of dancing snowflakes. Christopher watched the graceful crystals flutter about Holly's tumbled hair, and his heart twisted within him. Perhaps a tiny voice within him dared, but the whisper was crushed by the iron hand of logic. Impossible. But the snow, the tiny voice persisted. Explain that. It's all impossible. The snow is an optical illusion, and the girl is mad. She's not. She's the sanest person you've ever met. Santa Claus? Children's nonsense. Nonsense, he repeated aloud. Holly looked up. There's something I want to show you, she said. She reached into her bulging satchel, pulled forth the crystal music box, brought it to him. The 1,000 rainbows caught within it burst into color in the morning light and threw bright gem-like sparkles on the sober ceiling and walls of Christopher's studio. It's a very pretty box, said Christopher, looking at her questioningly. Holly didn't answer. She was listening to the first whispers of music that sang in her ears. The tune was like none she had ever heard before, wandering, beguiling, bending and swaying. It was like flying. It was like a secret. She lifted her eyes, wide with listening to Christopher. Do you hear it? She asked. He pitied her. I don't hear anything, he said gently. It's a very pretty box. Quite mad, he thought, wondering why it hurt him so. Holly's face became still again. The music faded. She looked miserably at Christopher. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I troubled you, Mr. Carroll. What time is it? She asked quickly. I don't know. 11, he said, unable to take his eyes from her face. He'll be back soon, she murmured, more to herself than him. I must go. Is it warm? Warm? I don't know. He roused himself. Yes, it does seem as though it's become rather warm. Perhaps our cold spell is over. He tried to speak normally. Our cold spell is over, she repeated. Then I haven't much time. Mr. Carroll, I have one last favor to ask you. Don't say no. She placed her fingers gently on his mouth to stop his words. Take this locket. It will protect you from harm. I know you don't believe in what I've said, but please. She lifted her fingers to the slim gold chain around her neck, and the metal dissolved as if it were water. Please, will you put it in your pocket, near your heart? He nodded once and held out his hand. She placed the locket in his palm and then closed his hand around it. They looked at each other without saying a word. Put it in your pocket, she said finally, and he tucked it into his waistcoat. She nodded. Don't give it to him. No matter what he says or does, keep the locket. Promise me. I promise. Goodbye, she said simply and turned away. Holly, he burst out. She shook her head without looking back and slipped through the door. Don't go, he said quietly. With her satchel in her hand, Holly trailed down the dark staircase for the last time. Before she could stop herself, she looked to the corner where Tundra had always sat, and its emptiness was like broken glass in her throat. She stopped, dizzy with sorrow. Jeremy and Mr. Kleiner stopped their dealings with customers to hurry to her side. Holly, said Jeremy anxiously, you look terrible. Not terrible, assured the kind Mr. Kleiner, but distraught and tired. Do sit down, Miss Claus. Hastily, he brought a stool forward and gestured to it invitingly. Dear Mr. Kleiner, said Holly gratefully, I shall never forget your good heart. It's time for me to go now, my friend. I wish, oh, how I wish that I could stay, but I can't. Miss Claus, are you all right? Asked Mr. Kleiner. You don't look well enough to travel. Despite her pain, Holly almost laughed at that. Bless you, Mr. Kleiner. She hesitated. Watch over Mr. Carroll, will you? He nodded seriously, and she knew that he took her request to heart. Miss Claus, thank you for what you've done for the shop, and for all of us, and for me. He reached out to shake her hand, then thought better of it and kissed her forehead instead. Thank you. Holly turned to Jeremy. He backed away, his mouth straightening into a stubborn line. Don't you say it, Holly. Don't you say goodbye to me. I'm coming with you. Oh, Jeremy, my dear, don't come. It might be dangerous. Nuh-uh, he shook his head firmly. I don't care. You ain't got Tundra. I'm coming with you. See you off. Her eyes shone. You are a loyal friend, Jeremy. Thank you. Is it all right, Mr. Kleiner? Yes, of course. Go, my boy, said Mr. Kleiner, wisely stifling his curiosity as to what could possibly be so dangerous about a train station. Wearily, Holly picked up her satchel and turned to go. Without a word, Jeremy pulled the bag from her hand and placed himself at her side. As they walked through the door, a blast of warm, moist air greeted them, and Holly staggered. Just hang on to me, Holly. We'll get there, urged Jeremy. She put her hand on his shoulder and took a deep gulp of tepid air. This is Harakon's doing, she murmured. She could not be sure. But indeed, Harakon's force of evil had caused this supernatural heat storm, so even Holly's magical snowflakes were unable to protect her. Jeremy, who had not the slightest idea what she was talking about, nodded sympathetically. Tell me who's Harakon, he said, hoping to distract her. He's a being who will try to stop me from going home, Holly said. I think he'll be at the park when we get there. She tried to hurry, but the close air seemed to grow thicker by the minute. Does it look like all the snow has melted? Her eyes didn't seem to be working properly. Jeremy looked at the ground. Yep, turning to slush. And look over there, he pointed. It's sort of steaming. It was true. The summer heat that beat down on New York on that winter's day not only melted the snow, but sizzled it into steam. All up and down the street, shopkeepers and bypassers were looking up into the sky with puzzled, worried faces. All of a sudden, it just turned hot, they were saying. I've never seen anything like it. On Christmas Eve, too. Feels like the devil's work. Must be 80 degrees, maybe more. Sure doesn't seem like Christmas. Children turned their eyes away from the sweltering sky, disappointed. Children who had whooped into the street with their sleds at 8 o'clock that morning now stood in disconsolate clusters, watching their snow dribble into puddles. "Hey, there's the doll lady!" shouted a little girl outside the bakery. Summoning up her strength, Holly smiled toward the call, for her vision was blurred, and things gleamed strangely. On Jeremy's shoulder, her hand grew heavy. "Why, it's the girl with the dream dolls!" "Miss, thank you," called a voice from a carriage. Holly nodded her head blindly as Jeremy guided her against the scudding waves of heat that billowed from the very bricks around her. She grew paler and paler. The cheerful greetings that met the little procession were more and more replaced by looks of concern. Far away, Nicholas thrust the telescope aside and began to pace around Holly's room like a caged animal. Viviana and Sophia watched him in silence. He stopped and chewed his knuckle. Then he paced. "I'm leaving now," he said, finally. "Christmas Eve will come early this year." "Nicholas, you can't stop this from happening," Sophia reminded him. Nicholas stopped chewing his knuckle for a moment. "I know," he said. "I know that. I just can't stand to watch anymore." "Oh, yes. Go in peace, then." The distraught king hurried from the room. Across the city of New York, strange things were happening. The crisp blue sky of winter had now faded to the color of a bruise. Thick yellow clouds hovered over the towers of the metropolis, and the air was filled with a greasy softness. The streets, with their sweating brown bricks, now seemed like tunnels, and the pungent, spicy smells of Christmas were foiled by a putrid stench that rose from the darkest corners of the city. There was a faint buzzing, too, as if angry, stinging insects were penned somewhere underneath the granite streets, waiting for release. This thin sound invaded the minds of the citizens and stretched their nerves. People jumped guiltily when they were spoken to and twisted their heads around to get a better look at a dark shape they had seen from the corners of their eyes. Big-bellied, complacent businessmen rushed down Wall Street as if pursued. Little children sat quietly in corners, hiding their eyes. Horses shied and whinnied. Kindly old dogs growled at their masters. Aged spinsters began to rip their petticoats into bandages as though a war had begun. Out in the harbor, the captain of a little tugboat looked at a green shape floating just beneath the surface of the water and gave swift orders to return to dock. But suddenly, another sound was heard. The children heard it first. In crowded, airless tenement rooms and prosperous stone mansions, children uncovered their eyes and listened in wonder. The dream dolls were speaking. "Go," they said. "Go now. Holly needs you. Remember, love conquers time. You must go now." The children took up their dolls in grubby hands and tiny ones and began to walk toward Central Park. Grown-ups are hard of hearing, or perhaps just hard of believing. Some pretended they didn't notice the dolls speaking. Some even tried to hold the children back with scoldings, but the weird lowering clouds had unsettled them, and the buzz seeping up from the pavement had frightened them. The light, chiming voices of the dolls and children were soothing, and despite themselves, the adults began to listen. They began to believe. Without really noticing what they were doing, the grown-ups drifted out onto the stone sidewalks and began to walk toward Central Park. Far ahead, Jeremy and Holly rounded the corner into the plaza and entered the park. They were walking very slowly now, for Holly had grown so weak that it was only her will that was keeping her upright at all. All the color had drained away from her face, and she looked somehow transparent. Jeremy, sick with fear, could not speak, but Holly was talking about Tundra to keep herself from falling. "One time, when I was a very little girl, I hid from him in the garden. It was freezing that day, and we were the only ones out, he and I." She gasped for air and then continued. "And it was beautiful. Do you know, Jeremy, dear, that you cannot hide from a wolf? Not really, anyway." Holly stumbled, but Jeremy caught her. "Thank you. Because, you see, they have the most acute sense of smell. The most—" She paused, dazedly. "Where was I?" "He was hiding." "Yes, I was. And Tundra, he loved me so. So he pretended that he could not find me. I watched him hunt for me behind the bushes and trees. He was pretending, but you see, I didn't understand that. And suddenly I was so frightened I began to cry because—" She took a great hollow gulp of air. "I had realized for the first time that we were two instead of one. I had never known that we could be separated." She staggered and then straightened. And when he heard me crying, he jumped to my side like flying. He was so fast. He was so fast. She stopped. And now we're two again. I can't go any farther. Jeremy looked around. It was a particularly empty stretch of the park. Before them was the sheep meadow, which had lain under a blanket of snow that morning. Now it had turned into a sea of mud, held together with bits of grass and the odd pile of rapidly melting slush. There was a thin iron bench overlooking the swampy expanse, and there Jeremy led Holly. She sat with a sigh. After a moment, she reached her hand into the lumpy satchel and began to feel for the silken scarf that contained her tiny friends. She patted and rustled, and finally peered into the bag. No, she whispered. They're lost again. They were not lost. A few minutes after Holly's departure, Alexia, Euphemia, and Empy had wiggled and shrugged and pushed their way out of the folds of the green silk that seemed determined to baffle them. Finally, Euphemia worked her wings free and spread them wide. Skedaddle, skedaddle, skedee, she said breathlessly, and with a quiet pop, she, Lexi, and Empy regained their rightful sizes. They looked around cautiously, but Christopher Carroll was not in sight. Well, where is he? Hissed Lexi. My goodness, look at that shining doll. Ugh, it walks, exclaimed Euphemia, hopping backwards to avoid a robot. Empy, quiet Empy, spoke up. Stop fussing about dolls. Holly's in trouble, he said firmly. First, we have to find Mr. Carroll, and then somehow make him go to the park with the locket. Impressed, Lexi and Euphemia nodded. There was a silence. Well, where do we find him? Euphemia asked the penguin. As if in answer to her question, Christopher Carroll entered his workroom and walked restlessly to the window. He did not notice the 3 new additions to his menagerie of toys. He did not notice anything. He stood gazing at the purple-yellow sky and the sodden squash of mud that lay in the street below. Not like Christmas at all, he murmured. The animals watched him and exchanged anxious glances. How could they begin to persuade him to believe Holly? What would he do if they began to talk? Tundra had said that humans were terrified of talking animals. Would he think that he had gone mad? Empy, driven by his heart's devotion, became brave. He looked around the buzzing, glinting room, and something caught his eye. On Christopher's work table, 4 little wooden animals rested where Holly had placed them with shaking hands the night before. Inside the satchel, bouncing along in a bed of green silk, Empy had heard Holly describe the animals to Tundra that morning. They were identical to you and Lexi and Euphemia and Empy. It was as though you had all been destined to play a part in my life. And his, perhaps, she had added musingly. Empy squinted. There were the figures. He knew what to do. Gesturing to the other two to follow him, he waddled over to the table and climbed laboriously up Christopher's chair. Much more gracefully, Lexi and Euphemia ascended the table, and, as he turned, startled by the rustle and creak, Christopher Carroll was greeted by the sight of a small red fox and a great white owl perched behind his own wooden figures of the same beasts. With a grunt and a heave, a penguin rolled onto the table and joined his own model. The 6 of them stood there in a line, facing him. Christopher's eyes moved slowly from one to the other. Even their expressions were the same as their wooden counterparts, he observed. He picked up the single wooden wolf and looked at it closely. It was identical to the animal that had guarded Holly. He saw now, even down to the wise and watchful eyes. He looked gravely into Lexi's face, then Euphemia's, and finally Empy's. You belong to her? He asked. They nodded. He sat back in the chair. Somehow now it didn't surprise him that they understood him. It was strange how easily a world constructed of logic could shatter when it faced the secret universe beyond logic. The destruction of Christopher Carroll's carefully created lonely life took only a moment, and, he reflected, it hurt a great deal less than his refusal to believe Holly had. Something closed and cold within him began to unfurl and grow. It had been so many years since he had last encountered it that he did not recognize the feeling as hope. Quietly, he asked, You were from her land. What did she call it? The land of the immortals? Yes, said Empy in a low voice. You talk too? Christopher said without alarm. Yes. Have I become insane? Look at us, Mr. Carroll. Isn't it easier to believe that we are real than to try to explain our presence by any other means? Euphemia and Lexi stared. It was the longest speech they had ever heard from Emby's mouth. Think, Mr. Carroll. Years ago, you made these little creatures that look just like us. It shows, don't you see, that even then you were a part of Holly's life. And the letter I wrote to Santa Claus. Your letter was the beginning of her existence, said Emby. Christopher closed his eyes. And it's all just as she said? Everything she said is true about Emby. Everything, Lexi added, including the part about Heracon. It's happening right now. Christopher's eyes clicked open. What will he do? He will try to force her to give her heart to him, to become his possession, said Lexi. Then he's going to kill her, said Euphemia. She turned her huge black eyes on Christopher's face. The locket's the only thing that can save her, and you've got it, and he's going to kill her. Christopher stared at her. Wordlessly, he reached into his waistcoat and brought forth the locket. It shone more brightly than ever. He seemed to see her face, warm and trusting, before him. There she was, her fingers grasping his as he pulled her from the swath of velvet. Why do you keep coming back? She had said. Because we belong to each other, he thought. A faint whisper of music reached him. The tune was like nothing he had ever heard before, wandering, beguiling, bending. He looked around distractedly. Who was playing the music? And found himself staring at the music box Holly had left behind. Now he heard the music. It was like flying. It was like a secret. He heard her saying, every time you make a choice, you make the future. And he knew now that there was only one future he wanted. I believe you. I believe you, he thought. It might be too late, something inside him warned. Go. Now. Run. Where is he? Where is she? He said, rising to his feet. The park, said Emby. She went to the park to meet her father. Come on, he said, scooping up Emby. Let's go find her. Then, with a penguin under one arm, a fox at his heels, and an owl flying overhead, Christopher Carroll strode from his lonely, bitter past into his future. Chapter 23.